In today's episode, we're going to be creating a simple currency GUI, which will hook up to our state manager that we created in the last episode. Now, when it comes to creating GUIs on Roblox, there are many of different ways that you could actually do this. So we're effectively going to use this episode as a foundation to explain and get you on the same page as to how I create my GUIs to look visually appealing and scale on all different devices. Now, inside of Studio, one of the most important things that actually helps or handles this is inside of the starter player scripts, we have a local script called UI Scaler. And this script actually handles scaling the GUIs to all different devices automatically for us. So when it comes to creating GUIs in this episode, I'm going to be explaining a couple of different very important things that are involved here. But if you want more information or you feel confused and you want to learn more by the end of this episode, then I'm going to leave a link down below in the description to a video I made a couple months ago, really going in detail and explaining every single thing about my entire GUI creation process when it comes to creating them inside of Studio and scaling them for all different devices. Still, I don't think that you'll actually need to watch that video because we're going to be explaining the most important things here, but I figured that's worth mentioning. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to do when it comes to creating a GUI is we're going to want to use Device Emulation, which will effectively allow us to all create GUIs at the exact same device resolution or screen size. And that's very important because all of our screen sizes can be different, so we want to make sure that when we're creating our GUI, we're creating it at effectively the exact same screen size. So to do this, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go to the Test tab. And inside of the Test tab, you should see the Emulation section. We're going to want to click on the Device button, and then once you click on the Device button, your screen may look a little bit different than mine. But we have two drop-down menus right here, and let's first click on the left one. On the left one, this allows us to select the specific device that we would like to emulate our screen size to. Now, when I create my GUIs, personally, I prefer to go with a specific resolution that's 1920 by 1080, as that's generally the largest screen size that anybody should be playing your game on. Of course, that doesn't mean it will be the largest one, but that's probably going to be the most common largest one. So now that I've selected the 1920 by 1080, we also have a drop-down on the right, which I've set Fit to Window. There's a couple of different options here. We have physical size, and when we do physical size, depending on your screen size, it can create scroll bars, and you may have to use them to actually navigate and see different parts of your screen. If you set it to actual resolution, this might be the same way, but the scroll bars might be a little bit different. Again, it all depends on what your screen size actually is. But for 99% of my time, I'm always using the Fit to Window mode. So now that we've enabled device emulation, we can begin creating the GUI. Whenever we create a GUI, we always create and store those GUIs inside of the starter GUI. This is where everybody creates their GUIs inside of Roblox. The reason for that is because all the GUIs that we create inside of the starter GUI, when we start our game up, Roblox will automatically replicate all of the GUIs that we've created inside of the starter GUI directly to the player object when they join our game. So inside of the starter GUI, I'm going to go ahead and create a Screen GUI. Now, I would describe a Screen GUI as a non-visible canvas. And what I mean by that is when we created the Screen GUI inside of the starter GUI, we don't see anything appearing on our screen. But any GUI element that we add inside of the Screen GUI will actually appear on our screen, of course, as long as the enabled property is set to true on the Screen GUI, which it is by default. So just to give you an example of exactly what I mean, if we add a frame, which is a GUI element, to the Screen GUI, then we see a white square at the top left-hand corner of our screen. But if we put the same exact frame inside of the starter GUI, we don't actually see that frame displayed on our screen. So that's why we need to use a Screen GUI to display GUI elements on our screen. Now, when it comes to creating a Screen GUI, there's two properties that I generally almost always like to change. The first one is Ignore Gui Inset. Usually I'll set this to true, and the second is Reset on Spawn, and usually I'll set this to false. Now, I think it's much easier to explain and visually show you exactly why we do that after we fully finish creating this GUI. So once we're done creating this, then I'll go ahead and come back and edit those properties. Okay, so to begin creating the GUI, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create our first visual element, which is going to be a frame. You can think of this frame as sort of the container, which is going to hold and display all of our other GUI elements as well, which sounds kind of similar to a Screen GUI, but the frame itself is actually visible and we can see it on our screen right now. Now, when it comes to my method of how I create GUIs, there's two very important principles. The first one is that the primary frame, which we store most or all of our GUI elements inside of, we should set the size of it using offset rather than scale. When we use offset, that allows our UI scaler script to automatically resize this for different device sizes, which is exactly what we want. So the first thing that we're going to do is adjust the size property of this frame. Now, if you look at the size property, we can see that there is an X and a Y axis. By default, the size is already set in offset. So with this specific frame, what we want to do is we want to make it a little bit less taller, but also we want to make it a little bit wider as well. So since we want to make it a little bit less tall, on the Y-axis, we're going to set this to 65. And then on the X-axis, we're actually going to set this to 265. And now this frame is actually going to hold two different currency displays inside of it. And we're going to use something pretty cool called automatic size, but I'll show you that after we've created our first currency display, and we're going to want to create our second one. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reposition the frame. And where do we want our currency labels to appear? Well, generally, depending on what type of game you're making, you might want, if you're making a simulator game, you're probably going to want this to appear in the middle right of your screen. So right now it's on the left, and generally you would either have these on the left middle or the right middle of your screen. Now, I want this to appear towards the middle right of our screen. So what I'm going to do is for the anchor point on the X-axis, I'm going to set this to 1. But now for the position, rather than using offset, I'm actually going to use scale, and I want to set this to 1 as well. And now this actually appears towards the top right-hand corner of our screen. So now what I want to do is bring this down a little bit, and because I want to center this vertically. So now we want to go ahead and adjust the Y of the position and the anchor point as well. So for the anchor point on the Y-axis, I'm going to set that to 0.5. And for the position on the scale of the Y-axis, I'm going to set that to 0.5 as well. And now we have this frame appearing towards the right middle of our screen. Okay, so now we're almost fully finished with setting this frame up, but we're going to come back to it in just a minute. What we're then going to do is add another frame inside of here, and this frame is actually going to be used to actually display a specific currency. The original frame right here is sort of acting as a container, which is just going to hold other frames inside of it, like this one. So I'm going to rename this frame right here to the specific currency that I want to display inside of it. And the specific currency that I want to display inside of it is going to be coins. So now, for the size of this, we're actually going to use scale instead of offset. We're completely fine with using offset inside of here, but because of how we set up the original frame, it just allows us to easily use scale and not have to worry about specific numbers in the offset. So what I mean by that is on the X-axis, rather than using 100 offset, we're actually going to set the scale to 1. That means that the horizontal size of our frame is now actually 265 because 1 on the scale actually makes it stretch the entire width of the parent frame. So that's actually how scale works. But now when it comes to the Y-axis, we're actually going to use offset for this, and we're going to set that to 65. Now you might be thinking, well, couldn't we just set that to 1 as well because the parent frame is also set to 65? And that is kind of true, but like I said, remember, we're going to store two different frames inside of here, and we actually want both of these frames to have a height of 65 pixels. And then once we create both of those, we're actually going to change the automatic size property of the parent frame to something different, which will effectively change the size of the frame on the Y-axis a little bit because it'll automatically resize itself when we do that. And I feel like that might sound confusing, but hopefully I explained that well enough. Now, with our coins frame, the next thing that we want to do is update the background color of this. So for my background color, I'm gonna go with this nice little blue right here. And now we can see that the frame is now appearing as that blue color that I've selected. The next thing that I want to do is create a black stroke around this frame. So inside of the coins frame, I'm going to go ahead and add in a UI stroke to this. Now, this is a little bit unrelated to exactly what we're doing right now, but this is a perfect example for me to show you this. As you can see on the frame right here, we have a stroke that's going around it. We can see a slight black outline on both the top and the left, but we're unable to see any outline on the bottom of this frame. And that's kind of weird. And the reason for that is actually because we're using device emulation. So if we go back up to the top where we can select the different modes of device emulation and we change this to actual resolution, then we scroll our screen over a little bit, we can then see that we're actually able to see the black outline on the top, the left, and the bottom of the frame. But when we're in fit to window, we're not able to see that black outline towards the bottom. And the reason for this is because of the algorithm, or however Roblox actually scales the GUIs and different things like that to fit inside of the device emulation. So because we're using device emulation, you might see some odd little discrepancies like that. And you might think, well, that's actually really terrible. That's a really big deal. I should probably not use device emulation. But please don't go away from this video thinking that, because as you create GUIs over time, you'll quickly realize, oh, okay, that's just a simple little Roblox thing. That's not actually how it'll appear or look on any other device. It's simply because I'm using device emulation and that's how Roblox handles it, and unfortunately it's just not perfect. So if you're seeing any weird things like that, just change the mode and then look at it again and see if those weird things go away. And if those weird things go away, then you definitely know that it's just device emulation and it's not something you actually have to try to change or anything else like that. Anyways, now that we've added the UI stroke inside of here, what we want to do is we want to change the thickness of this stroke to 5 because we want it to be a little bit larger. Now that we've done that, we actually do see the black outline on the bottom, but at least to me, the top and the left look much larger than the stroke on the bottom. Again, if we change to actual resolution and then we take a look at it, we can see that the size is the exact same on every single side, so that's not something to worry about. Now, another thing that I want to do with this frame is I actually want to make it a little bit round. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a UI corner to this, which will allow us to round the corners. Now, the corner radius has a scale and offset property, and you're perfectly fine with using either of them, but I'm going to go ahead and use the offset property, and I want to set that to 25. Now that we've set that to 25, we can actually see that the corners have been rounded, and we can see some white behind them, and the reason for that is because of our actual frame behind that, which is white, and that's what we're actually seeing. So we can actually see that the corner of the coin's frame is being rounded perfectly fine. And now the next thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and add an image label inside of this frame as well, which we're going to use to display the specific icon of the currency. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to be called icon. And now the first thing we're going to do is set the image of this. Now, a quick little plug, I actually have a really nice free icon pack that you can use and you can get from my website, monster.dev. There will also be a link down below in the description to the GUI pack if you'd like to use it as well. Like I said, it's completely free and you're able to use all of our icons inside of your own Roblox game. Now, in order to actually add images to your Roblox game, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to the View tab, and inside of the View tab, you're going to want to enable the Asset Manager. Now, inside of the Asset Manager, you should see this little bulk import button right here. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to the folder with all of your icons inside of it, select all of those icons, and then click on Open. Once you've done that, you should see them all being uploaded directly to Roblox, and you should be good to go. Of course, if you see any errors, then you should be able to easily Google them and solve them, but for the most part, you should not face any errors. Sometimes things like the Twitter icon might fail to upload, and you may have to rename that, for example, but for the most part, you should be able to upload all of the icons perfectly fine. Anyways, once all those icons have been uploaded to Roblox Studio, you should be able to look inside of the images folder, inside of your asset manager, and find whatever icon you're looking for right here. Once you found the icon that you're actually looking for, go ahead and right click it and click Copy ID to Clipboard, and then you're going to want to paste the ID inside of the UR field for the image, and then you should see that icon visibly right there. So now that we've set the image of this, I'm going to go ahead and close my asset manager. And then what we're going to do is set the background transparency of this image label to 1 so that we no longer see the background. The next thing that I always like to do is actually change the scale type of the image to fit rather than stretch, because that prevents the image from stretching depending on how you actually resize it. Then what we're going to do is resize this icon, and rather than making it 100 by 100, I'm actually going to make it 50 by 50. Next, what we're going to want to do is move this towards the middle right-hand side of the frame. So we're going to pretty much do the exact same thing that we did for the positioning of the very first frame that we created. So on the anchor point, on the y-axis, we're going to set that to 0.5, and on the y-axis of the position, we're going to set the scale of that to 0.5 as well, and now that's centered vertically. Then horizontally, we want this to appear all the way to the right, so for the anchor point on the x-axis, we're going to set that to 1, and then for the position on the x-axis, we're also going to set that to 1 as well. Now with the icon, we actually want this to appear a little bit further from the right-hand side. We don't really want this to be touching the very edge of the frame. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the position, and on the x-axis, we actually want to adjust the offset, and we're going to set that to about -5, which will make this image appear 5 pixels from the very far right-hand side of the frame itself. And now that's actually something that I should have done originally with this frame, because we can see that this frame is all touching the very far right-hand side of the screen. So let's go back to the position of this as well, and let's just adjust the x-axis, and let's adjust the offset of the x-axis of the position a little bit and set that to -5. So now it appears all the way towards the right, but 5 pixels from the very far right-hand side of the screen, and it's no longer touching the right-hand side. Again, it might look like it's very close to touching. I would use actual resolution to judge that, and it actually seems like it still might be touching. So if you want this to appear a little bit further, we can go ahead and adjust it a little bit more. more. It probably is actually touching because we did actually give our frame the stroke of 5 pixels, so it would make sense. So maybe we want to increase this a little bit more and set that to something like -10. And now it should actually be appearing about 5 pixels from the right, because we also have to calculate in the UI stroke, which is 5 pixels itself. So I think it's now accurate to say that this is actually appearing 5 pixels from the very far right-hand side of the screen, including the stroke itself. Anyways, I'm going to swap this back to fit to window, and then let's go back to the icon. And now where we left off was the icon, but we're actually completely finished with adjusting the icon, so we don't even have to go back to that. The next thing I want to do is actually display the amount of coins that the player has inside of here, and we need to do that by using a text label. So we're going to go ahead and add a text label to this frame. We're going to rename this text label to be called amount. And now this is one of the kind of core things that I do whenever I'm scripting. If there's ever a text label which I'm going to update by scripting, I generally keep the names of those things pretty consistent. So if it's a number that I'm going to be changing, I'll generally name that amount. Of course, you can name this something like currency or coins or different things like that. But I think that by the end of this video, you'll have at least a decent understanding as to why it's a good idea to keep the names that you use for different text elements pretty consistent, like using the word amount, for example. So now that we've created the amount text label, the next thing that we're going to do is first adjust the text of this from saying label to saying something like 1 million, for example. That's just a very long number, or we could even say something like 100 million so that we can see what this looks like, so that we can see what our text label will actually look like when the player has a large amount of coins. And now the next property that I want to update is the text size, and we want to make this a little bit larger. Now remember how when we began creating this GUI, I said that there's going to be 2 core principles when it comes to using our scaling method and creating our GUIs. This is the second core principle, and that is to never ever use the text scaled property. Instead, what you should do is use the text size property and set it to the specific size that you want your text to appear as, and then our UI scaling script will automatically handle that and resize it to display perfectly on all different devices. So for my text size, I'm going to increase this a little bit, and I actually want to set this to about 30. And then the next thing that I want to do is actually adjust the text X alignment, because by default it's set to center, but we're going to change this to right because we want our text to appear towards our actual icon image label. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and select a specific font face. My 2 favorite font faces are probably Fredoka 1 or Gotham, which I think this font is actually being replaced by another custom Roblox one. So in case you don't see Gotham in the future, that's probably why. But either way, I'm going to go ahead and go with my Fredoka 1. That's personally, which is one of my favorite ones, as this is kind of more of the cartoony themed one. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and adjust the background transparency so we don't see that white background, and we're going to go ahead and set that to 1. Then what I want to do is go ahead and change the text color of this and actually make the text white. Now that's all looking pretty good. One of the last things that we want to do is go ahead and reposition this. Now vertically, we of course want to center this. But when it comes to horizontal, what we want to do is we want this to appear a little bit to the left of our icon image label. And for the most part, you should have a pretty good understanding of how to do this. So if you want to test your own understanding of this, what I'd recommend you do is maybe pause the video right here and try this out yourself. And if you struggle at all, or you want to skip this challenge, then feel free to unpause the video or continue watching it. Anyways, first we're going to center this vertically because that's the easiest thing. So for the anchor point on the y-axis, we're going to set that to 0.5, and on the scale of the y-axis of the position, we're going to set that to 0.5 as well, and now we have this centered vertically. Now when it comes to the horizontal positioning, what we're going to do is we're going to first set the anchor point to 1, and then on the x-axis, we're going to set the scale of the position to 1 as well. And now we can either do a little bit of math, or we can play around with the x offset a little bit ourselves. Now, what I mean by doing a little bit of math is, first what we would do is we would look at the size of the icon image label, and more specifically, we would want to look at the x-axis. And we can see that horizontally, this is 50 pixels. So when it comes to the position on the x-axis, for the offset, let's go ahead and set that to -50. Now that we've done that, it is pretty much just touching the icon image label itself. It is actually overlapping it a tiny bit, and that's because we also have to account for the position of the icon image label as well, which we actually subtracted 5 pixels from the right-hand side, so we also need to factor that in as well. So if we set this to -55, then that means that it should just barely be touching or just right on the edge of the image label. And if we kind of zoom in a little bit or use actual resolution, we can see that it's we can see that it's either touching or maybe there's like 1 pixel of space in between the text label and the icon image label itself. But now to add a tiny bit more spacing to this, what I'm going to do is set that to -60, and that should give it about a perfect 5 pixel spacing between the text label and the icon image label itself. And now I'm going to change my emulation mode back to fit to window. It doesn't really matter. I'm just kind of, you don't need to change your emulation mode at all. I'm just kind of trying to do that to zoom in and show you different things or certain things like that. But anyway, one of the last things that we want to do with the text label is we just kind of want to resize it a tiny bit. We just want to resize it enough to make sure that it's within the bounds of where we would want to display text inside of our coins frame. And I think for the most part, it would have been fine to leave this at 200 width. But just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and just resize this a little bit. And the size that I went with is 175. If you want to make sure that you're doing this all right to see how your text appears and everything like that, let's set that to 100. And now that should be appearing all the way towards the right. If yours isn't appearing towards the right, then you probably forgot to set the text X alignment property to right, so make sure that you do that. Anyways, one of the last things that we want to do with this text label is we want to go ahead and add in a UI stroke to this. And now for the thickness of the stroke, I'm going to go ahead and set that to 3. Okay, so I've updated the text of my text label just to show you one more thing with the UI stroke. Whenever I use a UI stroke on text, what I like to do is change the line join mode from round to bevel or miter. And the reason for that is because when this is set to round, you should look at these O's right here. Inside of the inner part of these O's right here, and kind of the P is a little bit harder to see, but kind of on the inner circle of letters, whenever you use the line join mode round, and then depending on the character and even the thickness size, the inner circles, the kind of inner circles of different characters don't get filled in when you're using the round line join mode. But if we swap this over to miter or bevel, we can actually see that the circles inside of the characters are now filled in with the stroke as well. So that's why whenever I use a UI stroke on a text label, I will always set it to either bevel or miter because I really don't like how round actually makes the stroke appear inside of specific characters. But bevel and miter have never done that for me, so that's my go-to method whenever I'm adding the stroke to letters. Anyway, I'm going to reset the stroke back to 3, and then I'm going to reset the text to saying 100 million again, just like that. Okay, so now that we've done that, we fully finished with actually creating our first currency label. Now, like I said, we don't want to just display coins though, we also want to display the player's gems as well. And that requires us to do a couple of different things. So to start off, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this frame. You can do this by either right-clicking it and clicking the duplicate button, or depending on how your keybinds are set up, you should be able to select the frame and then hit Control D, which will just duplicate or clone that existing frame. Now, we don't see anything visually appearing on top of our screen because this was just cloned with the exact same size with all the exact same properties of it. So its position, size, and everything like that exactly the same way. If we kind of just drag this a little bit, we should be able to actually drag it and now actually see the clone. But I'm going to go ahead and undo that because we're actually not going to move it at all. Anyways, let's go ahead and rename this frame to be called gems. Then what I want to do is inside of the container frame, aka the first frame that we ever created, I want to go ahead and add in a UI list layout. And now once we've added in the UI list layout, we can actually see that one of our frames has actually been moved down a little bit, and that is our gems frame. And that's actually what a UI list layout does. It effectively allows us to easily lay out different GUI elements that are stored inside of the exact same frame. So if we take a look at the UI list layout, it has a couple of different properties here. One of the easiest ones to explain would be the fill direction. By default, it is set to vertical, so the UI elements are laid out from top to bottom. But if we set this to horizontal, then it would be laid out left to right. And now we can see that actually, and we can kind of see that right there. Of course, we are going to want to leave this as vertical. Another property that we have is padding, and that's actually one of the properties that we want to use here. We actually want to adjust the offset of the padding property. And what padding does is it basically allows you to specify the spacing between all of the GUI elements. And I'm going to want about 15 pixels of spacing between each of the currency labels. And now that we've set that to 15, we can actually see the spacing directly between those two frames. We have a couple of other properties inside of the alignment section, like the horizontal alignment or the vertical alignment, which is pretty commonly used, but we're actually not going to need to adjust either of these here. But if you were to adjust them, like one we could actually adjust is the vertical alignment. So that would change how these are aligned based on the actual parent frame itself. So now these are actually centered vertically. This is what it looks like when the vertical alignment is set to bottom, and this is what it looks like when it's set to top. Either way, like I said, we're not going to be using that here. Another important thing though is actually the sort order, which by default it is set to layout order. And to demonstrate the layout order property, every single GUI instance actually has a property on it called layout order. And we can use this property to work with things like UI list layouts to specify the order in which in which different elements are displayed. So depending on if you get lucky or not when you're creating your GUI, you may not even have to adjust the layout order. For instance, we're going to want our coins frame to appear on the top, and on the bottom we want our gems frame to be displayed. So that's already happening here. That means that we don't really have to adjust the layout order, but let's say that these were reversed and we actually want to change them. Let's say that I want to put the gems frame on the top. What I could do right now is, since both of these are set to 0, I could set this to -1. And since -1 is a lower layout order than the layout order of coins, which is 0, that means that coins will then appear after gems because that number is after -1. Although it probably is good practice to say go with 0 for gems if we want that to appear towards the top, and then if we want coins to appear on the bottom, we would set that to 1. Now, I actually want coins to appear over top of gems, so I'm going to set coins to 0, and I'm going to set gems to 1, just like that. Anyways, now that we've done all of that, I want to go back to a specific property on the frame, which is the automatic size property that I was referring to earlier. Now remember, the size of this frame is actually 65 pixels on the y-axis, and we can kind of see that frame still appearing here because of the white background that's displayed behind our very first frame that's inside of it. And now if we look at the absolute size, this actually tells us the exact size of the frame itself, which we can see on the y-axis is 65. What we're going to do is we're going to change the automatic size to y so that the size actually changes and adapts based on the elements that are stored inside of it. And now that we've set the automatic size to y, we can see that the size property is still set to 65, and that has not actually changed. But what has changed is the absolute size, which again you can think of as the actual size. And on the y-axis, this is now set to 145. And if you're not sure how that got to 145, well, let's just do the math. Both of our frames are 65 pixels tall, so 65 plus 65 is 130. And then for this to be 145, we get the remaining 15 pixels from the 15 pixels that we have in the UI list layout for the padding. So that's exactly how we get to the Y size of 145. Now, you don't need to use automatic size. You could just set this to none and then just set the size of directly set the size of the frame to 145. But at the same time, we don't need to. Why not just use automatic size? It might make things a little bit more complicated, but I just kind of wanted to show that off to teach you guys kind of a secret little thing that people might not learn about. Anyways, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually update our gems frame a little bit. And really, all that we need to adjust is actually the image of the icon image label. And this time when I set my image, I'm not going to try to look for the image inside of our asset manager. I'm actually just going to scroll through here and look at the different images that appear inside of my game. And now I found the gem image right there, so I'm going to go ahead and use that one. And now we're all good with that. Maybe you want to adjust the text a little bit, so I'll actually adjust this to be something like 1000, for example. And there we go. We're actually pretty much fully finished with creating this entire thing. The last thing that I want to do, though, is actually set the background transparency of the primary frame to 1 so that we don't see the background. And now our currency displays are looking pretty nice. Let's just verify this by changing to actual resolution, taking a look at them, and I think that everything is looking perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse that frame. One of the last things that we want to do is rename the Screen Gui, and we're going to go ahead and call this currency. And now one final thing that we want to do with this Screen Gui, at least for now, is we actually want to add in a UI scale instance to this. The reason for that is because our UI scaler script is going to use our UI scale instance inside of every one of our Screen GUIs to know and actually scale that specific GUI. So whenever we're finished creating a GUI, we want to add in a UI scale instance to that Screen GUI. And then once we've done that, we want to add a tag to it. And the specific tag that we want to add is going to be called scale_component. Now make sure that you do spell this exactly the same way that I do. Otherwise, the UI scaler script will not find the UI scale and it will not scale the GUI. So make sure that your tag is called scale_component. In addition to that, we want to add an attribute to the UI scale as well, which is actually going to be of the vector2 type. And this attribute has to have a very specific name as well, which is going to be called base_resolution. So base_resolution. Again, make sure you spell that exactly the same way. And now for the value of this attribute, we want to set this to 1920, 1080. The reason that we're setting it to 1920 by 1080 is because that is the base resolution, aka the resolution in which at which we created this GUI. So remember when I said to use device emulation and emulate your device to 1920 by 1080? That's the specific resolution that we're specifying in the base resolution attribute right here. Now, alternatively, you could have actually created this GUI using an iPhone 4S, which has a resolution of 480 by 320. If you did that, then you would just set the base resolution to 480 by 320 rather than 1920 by 1080. Anyways, we did it at 1920 by 1080, so that's why we're setting it to this. And now that we've done that, we're actually fully finished with creating the GUI. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that because of the way that we're creating this GUI, whenever you turn off device emulation, your GUIs may appear to be in completely different sizes. And now that is perfectly fine and completely normal. Remember, our UI scaler script only works and runs in the game itself. So if we were to actually test this out by starting up our game, once we go into our game, we should see that the GUIs are appearing in the correct size like we see right here. They're not super large like we just saw before I started testing this. Now, since we're testing this is actually a perfect time for me to easily visually show to you one of the properties that we want to change with our Screen GUI. So I'm going to go inside of the player surface, inside of my player, inside of the player GUI object, and now I can see my Screen GUI that we created right here, which is called currency. Now, every single Screen GUI has a property of it called Ignore Gui Inset. And when I had this selected, you can kind of see this blue outline right here. And basically, this blue outline is kind of where the GUI is appearing at. Although we can see another blue outline appearing towards the very top of our screen, I think that's just kind of to outline the entire player screen. But effectively, our GUI is only being displayed up to this point, our Screen GUI at least. And the reason for that is because Roblox has its default top bar thing up here, which has the Roblox icon and then a couple of other buttons as well. So that is the actual inset, which kind of naturally pushes everything down in our game. So because that pushes all of our GUIs down, effectively that makes our GUI no longer appearing perfectly centered vertically. So if we want that to be perfectly centered vertically, then what we can do is set the Ignore Gui Inset property to true, and then we can see that that actually moves the GUI up a little bit because it's no longer being affected by the inset. And now again, we can see that we actually had that GUI selected, and now we no longer see that little blue outline below the official Roblox bar, which is right here. Of course, if we disable that property, we should be able to see the blue outline again, and whenever we enable it, it goes away and it moves the GUI up. So that's what the Ignore Gui Inset property actually does. Anyways, now that we understand how that property actually works, I'm going to go ahead and set the Ignore Gui Inset property of the currency Screen GUI to true, because that's generally what I do for almost all of my GUIs. Now, I almost forgot to go over this, but we can also test that our UI scaling is actually working by testing our game in different device resolutions. And we can do that by, once again, using the device emulation. So when we went ahead and tested this originally, I was testing this in my default device resolution. But we could also test this on mobile as well. So let's set this to a very, very small device, start up our game, and see how this looks. And now once we get into our game, we can actually see what the GUI is appearing as, and we can see that the GUI has been scaled down to be compatible with this device, and we can see that it's actually looking perfect. So that's how we know that the GUI scaling is working as it should be. Anyways, I'm going to set my emulation back to 1080, and I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it off. Now that we've created the GUI, the next thing that we're going to do is begin scripting this. And to begin scripting this, we're going to do that inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, and more specifically inside of the controllers folder. And now the first thing that I want to do is actually create a controller that we're going to use for any time we script a GUI. So we're going to go ahead and create a model script inside of here, and we're going to go ahead and call this the GUI controller. And then of course, we're going to go ahead and rename the module variable to our usual shared variable. And in addition to that, we also want to create a variable for the local table. We also want to create a variable for the local table as well, just like that. Now, inside of the script, what we want to do is we actually want to create a shared variable, which is going to contain a couple of key value pairs. The key is going to be the name of our GUI, and the value is actually going to be the literal GUI instance that's inside of the player's player GUI. So towards the top of our script, we're going to need to go ahead and get the player service. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called players, and then we'll say game get service players, just like that. Now, I accidentally used single quotes rather than double quotes. It literally doesn't matter there at all, but I'm going to go ahead and change it to double quotes just like that. Anyways, the reason that we've gotten the player service is because that will allow us to create a variable for the client, aka the local player. So we're going to create a variable called player, and we're going to set that equal to players.localPlayer, just like that. Now that we've created a variable for the local player, the next thing that we're going to want to do is create a variable for the player GUI, which is where all the GUIs that are stored inside of the starter GUI are replicated and then stored for the player whenever they join the game. So we're going to create a variable called Player GUI, which is going to be equal to player.playerGUI, just like that. And just to show you exactly what I mean, I'm going to go ahead and start my game. Then I'm going to look inside of the player service, inside of our player right here. And then inside of our player, we can see that I have an object called Player GUI. And if we take a look inside of there, we can see a couple of different Screen GUIs inside of here. Now, the FreeCam Screen GUI is actually Roblox's very own Screen GUI. But the Currency Screen GUI is the exact same Screen GUI that we created inside of the Starter GUI. So that's how Roblox actually handles GUIs. Whenever a player joins the game, basically, Roblox will replicate or duplicate the GUIs that are stored inside of the starter player and store the player's version of that GUI inside of the player GUI that's stored inside of their player object. So anytime we want to make modifications to the GUI, we actually need to make those modifications to the GUI that's stored inside of the player GUI, not the starter GUI. So now that we understand why we're using the player GUI, let's go ahead and actually use it. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and create a shared variable, which is going to be called GUIs, and that's going to be a table. And like I said, the way that our GUIs table is going to work is for the keys, we're going to use the name of the GUI. And then for the value, we're actually going to point that to the specific GUI, to the specific Screen GUI instance that we want to use. So with the GUI that we created today, our GUI is called Currency, and now to set it to the actual Screen GUI, we're going to say Player GUI, and then we're actually going to use the waitForChild method on it, and then we'll specify that we want to wait for the Currency Screen GUI. The reason that we need to use waitForChild is because this script can actually run before Roblox duplicates or replicates all of the GUIs from the starter GUI into the player's player GUI. I know that might not sound intuitive, and in my opinion, I would assume that whenever a local script or a module script on the client runs, it would only run after all of the GUIs have been replicated, because I feel like that is how kind of a player object would be fully finished creating. That's when all the scripts would run, but that's just not how Roblox did it. My first thought is that I feel like that's a very bad design decision, but Roblox probably has pretty valid reasons for handling it that way. I'm just not sure. But anyways, that's all that we're going to be doing inside of this GUI controller script, at least for now. As we go further into the series, we probably will add some functions and of course update the GUIs variable with more of our GUIs inside of here. But because that script is pretty empty for the most part, I wanted to show you some of the other things that we would use the GUI controller for so that you didn't feel like it was only for storing GUIs and everything else is kind of useless about it. Now I'm taking a look at my GUI controller from the obby series that I've created. Definitely check out the obby series if you want to learn how to make an obby and more about scripting and different things like that. But inside of the obby series, we can see that I store all of my GUIs inside of the GUIs variable. Additionally, I have a couple of shared functions in here like the handle progress bar function. And basically I use this one single function to handle all of the progress bars that are inside of our game. And we have a couple of different progress bars. In addition to that, I even created a shared function for toggling a blur effect for whenever a player opens or closes a GUI. We also have a setup GUI function which effectively just accepts the actual GUI itself, an open button if it has one, and an exit button if it has one as well. And it sets all those things up, like opening and closing the GUI and other things like that. So these are just a few of the different things that I add to my own GUI controller in another series that I'm working on. And like I said, I'm only showing you this so that you can see there's a couple of other things that we actually do inside of the GUI controller other than just storing the specific GUIs that we might want to have access to. Now, with that being said, another reason that we're actually using the GUIs variable is because it saves us time, from rewriting a few of the same lines of code in every single one of our GUI scripts. Like for instance, if we wanted to work on the Currency GUI, that would require us to one, create the player's variable, the local player variable, the player GUI variable, and then also create a variable for the Currency GUI as well. So right off the bat, this is saving us 4 lines of code every single time we want to script the GUI. And in addition to that, if there's any functions inside of the GUI controller that there's a chance that we would want to use those in other GUI scripts as well, then this just saves us even more time, because instead of doing all of that, we're already requiring the GUI controller, and then we can just use whatever function we were going to want to use anyway. And I understand that saving 4 lines of code really isn't significant at all, but hopefully I was able to help you see the bigger picture here and not just think it's only 4 lines of code being saved. Anyways, with that being said, we're finished with the GUI controller for this episode, so let's go ahead and start scripting the GUI itself. To do this, I'm going to go inside of the controllers folder, and I'm actually going to go ahead and create a brand new folder, which we're going to rename to be called GUIs. And inside of this folder is where we're going to store all the module scripts containing the logic for all of our different GUIs. So we're going to go ahead and create a module script inside of this GUIs folder, and we're going to rename this to be called Currency. Then, of course, inside of here, I'll go ahead and create my standard shared variable, as well as creating our local variable. Now, towards the top of our script, we're going to want to create some of our common variables. And the first 2 variables that we're going to create are ones that I kind of said we wouldn't have to create, but we actually do need to use the local player in the script, for example. So anyway, the first variable that we're going to create is going to be a variable for the player service. So we'll say game get service players, just like that. And then we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the local player. So we'll go ahead and say players.localPlayer. Now that we've created both of those variables, we then want to go ahead and require both of the controllers that we've created already. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the GUI controller. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and say require script.parent, which is going to take us to the GUIs folder that the currency script is stored inside of. Then we'll say .parent once again, which will actually take us to the controllers folder. And now that we're inside of the controllers folder, let's go ahead and use the GUI controller just like that. Then we also want to create a variable for the state controller, and we'll do that by saying require script.parent, which takes us to the GUIs folder, then .parent, which takes us to the controllers folder, and then we're going to go ahead and use the state controller just like that. Now that we've created both of those variables, the next thing that we want to do is create a variable for a few pieces of our GUI. So the first variable that I'm going to create is going to be called GUI, and we're going to set this variable to the specific GUI that we want to work with. So we'll go ahead and say GUI controller.GUIs.currency. Then let's go ahead and create a variable for the frame. So we'll go ahead and just say GUI.frame. Now that we've created that variable, we then want to create a variable for both of our currency frames stored inside of that frame. So I'll go ahead and create a variable called coins, which is going to be equal to frame.coins. And then I want to create a variable for the gems frame, which is going to be equal to frame.gems. And now that we've got a variable for each of those different GUI components that we're going to be using inside of the script, let's go ahead and actually begin creating some functions. Now, the first function that we're going to create is going to be a part of the local table, and we're going to call this update currency. And now this function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called currency, and that's going to be of the string type. And inside of this function, all we're going to do is update the amount text label stored inside of our currency frame with the specific amount of coins or gems that the player actually has. So because the only argument passed to this function is the actual currency that's been updated, what we're going to do is we're going to use an if statement, and we're going to check if the currency is coins. And if the currency is coins, then what we're going to do is update the text label inside of the coins frame called amount. So we'll go ahead and say coins.amount, and now we have the text label, and then we want to go ahead and update the text property of that. And now what do we want to update the text to? Well, we want to display the current amount of coins that the player has. And now to get that information, we can go ahead and use the state controller. So we'll go ahead and say state controller.get_state, and then we want to get the amount of coins that the player currently has. Then we can use an else or an else if statement here. It depends on how you set up your currency action. For example, I could see a lot of people adding additional currencies to this, so an else statement might not work here. So just to make sure that this works for everybody, I'm going to go ahead and use an else if statement here. And I'm going to say if the currency equals gems, then we'll go ahead and update the amount text label inside of the gems frame. And now what are we going to set that to? Well, of course, we would set it to pretty much the exact same thing, but instead of using coins, we'll go ahead and use gems this time. And now that's actually all that we're going to do with this function. The next thing that we want to do is go ahead and create the onStart function, which of course has to be a part of the shared table. And of course, it's not going to have any parameters. Now inside of this function, the first thing that we want to do is actually call the update currency function so that when the player joins the game for the first time, those text labels will be updated to reflect the amount of coins and gems that the player actually has. So let's go ahead and say local.updateCurrency, and then we want to call this for both gems and coins. So I'll go ahead and write that out twice. Again, we want to call that once for coins and then once for gems. Now the next thing that we want to do is hook up to our state controller so that we can update the text label of our currency frames whenever the player's currencies actually change. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and use the state controller. And remember, we created a bindable event inside of there called update state. So we can go ahead and use that event, and then we'll go ahead and connect to it and create an anonymous function inside of there and create an anonymous function. Now the first parameter that gets passed from this event is actually the action that was used to update the player's state. And that is of the state controller.state action type. Then what we want to do is we want to use an if statement, and we want to check if the type of the action is update currency. Because if it is update currency, then we want to go ahead and call the update currency function. And then we'll actually go ahead and pass through the currency property of our action. So we'll just say action.currency. And now anytime the player's coins or gems are updated from the server side, that will cause this event to be fired off and for this function to actually run because the currency has been updated. And then of course with the update currency function, that handles all the logic for actually displaying the current amount of coins or gems that the player has. Now remember how I actually created an action for update gems and update coins, and then we also created update currency? I created these two different different actions to kind of show you how you can create single actions, or you can create one big action to handle both of those. But of course, if you use update gems or the update coins action, then of course you need to add that here as well. So what I would do is I would say if action.action equals update coins, for example, then what we would want to do is call update currency, but then we would of course pass through coins because we're updating the coins. And then you could also do the same thing for update gems as well. But again, because we don't actually use either of those actions, I'm just going to go ahead and hook this to the update currency action just like that. And this will all work perfectly fine. So now we've hooked this up to the state controller and it'll keep it in sync with the player's data on the server side. We're actually fully finished with creating this script and we can go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and start up our game and see how this looks. So when we get into our game, we can actually see that the GUIs have been updated, and we can verify that they're synced up with the server by looking at the leader stats. So we can see that my gems are not being updated, but my coins are. And every single time my coins are being updated, those are increasing. And since the gems are not being updated, we can see that the gems have been synced when the player first joined the game initially because it displays 1050. So we can see that this is actually all working perfectly. Now we're pretty much fully finished with this entire thing, but one more thing that I want to show you is another property that I always like to adjust on the Screen GUI. And that specific property is the reset on spawn property. By default, this is set to true, and we can see exactly what happens by resetting our character. Now, once our character respawns, you might not have really been able to see it there, but basically the GUI is re-replicated over to the player, and because of that, we're now seeing errors inside of our output, and the GUI script is no longer actually functioning. And that's because the variable that we created for the currency GUI inside of our GUI controller, that same Screen GUI no longer actually exists. It's been replaced by a different Screen GUI, even though it's named the exact same thing and it's all pretty much the exact same thing. It's just a different version of that exact same Screen GUI. And because of how we write our scripts, there is no need for resetting the GUI. There's probably definitely use cases for that inside of Roblox. I'm not saying that there is no use cases, but for us, it's just absolutely pointless. So whenever I create a Screen GUI, I always set the reset on spawn property to false. And like I said, I always set the Ignore Gui Inset property for the most part to true. But I absolutely always set the reset on spawn property to false because I never, ever, ever use this property. And with that being said, we are fully finished with creating this and we are all good to go. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit monster.dev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.